The story of Job is one of the biblical episodes that most intensely portrays human suffering. Job was struck by a series of calamities, leaving him devastated in many ways. Job's suffering was physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. But Job's suffering was part of something bigger that he wasn't even aware of. God had allowed Satan to touch Job to prove that he was in fact a faithful believer and one who feared the Lord. Although Job didn't understand it, his suffering was meant to refine his faith. If you don't know me, my name is Daniel Conegero. I'm a theology professor, and in this video, we're going to study together everything the Bible says about Job's suffering. And we can start by understanding that all the drama that Job went through began in the financial area. But first, the text. The Bible says that Job was the richest man in the East. And indeed, the Bible indicates that Job had many possessions. According to the biblical writer, Job had a wealth of 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. With all that livestock, indeed, that was a lot. To manage all these possessions, the biblical text informs us that Job had many servants at his service. But suddenly all of this changed. Sabean raiders killed Job's servants and stole the oxen and the yoke from his herd while they were grazing. And when Job was still receiving this sad news, another messenger informed him that fire had fallen from heaven and burned the sheep and the servants who were tending them. But Job's financial suffering didn't end there. While the second messenger was still speaking, a third messenger arrived and told Job that Chaldean nomads had stolen his camels and killed his other servants. So, in the same day, the man who was the greatest in the East had lost all his material possessions. For a man, losing all his material possessions is obviously something very painful. But losing your family, your most precious asset, is certainly even more traumatic. Job hadn't even finished receiving the news about the loss of all his possessions when another messenger arrived to inform him that all his children were dead. Job was the father of 7 sons and 3 daughters. As we read in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 2, his family was very close-knit, as his sons and daughters had the habit of always gathering together, feasting at each other's houses. So, while Job's children were gathered in the house of the firstborn brother, a very strong wind blew and caused the house to collapse on them, killing them all. And in the face of such a great calamity, Job did not rebel against God. The biblical text says that Job only tore his clothes. He shaved his head as a sign of mourning and glorified the name of the Lord, acknowledging that God was the true owner of everything he had owned. One thing that stands out in Job's conduct is that, despite all his drama and suffering, he did not sin. So God allowed Satan to touch Job's health as long as he didn't take his life. And right away, Satan struck Job with terrible sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. And any attempt to identify the exact disease that struck Job is pointless. But it certainly caused him a great deal of physical suffering. The Bible says that Job lost weight, had a fever, and suffered from severe pain in his bones. Obviously, at this point, Job was also crushed by emotional suffering. He had to deal with the loss of all his possessions, with the death of his servants and children, and with the pessimism of his wife, his companion, who had survived all that disaster. Because of all this, the biblical text records that Job felt despair, anguish, had insomnia, a lack of joy, and was encouraged by his wife to curse God and hasten his tragic end. But Job did not win. He rebuked his wife and pointed out that God had the full right to do whatever he wanted with them. Who doesn't remember Job's words to his wife when he said, "You speak as any foolish woman would. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil?" And the biblical text concludes by saying that in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And, in light of all these things, we can understand that Job not only faced physical and mental suffering, but also social and spiritual suffering. If Job's own wife was advising him to end that situation and accept certain death, Job's friends, when they came to visit him, started trying to find fault with him. Basically, Job's friends claimed that he was suffering because he was a terrible sinner. Consequently, in a context where people interpreted Job's drama, under the logic of retribution, Job was socially rejected and mocked. The Bible says that people gathered to mock Job. He was surrounded by mockers, and he had become an abomination to men. Job felt as if people were constantly spitting in his face. If Job was judged by his own wife and by his friends, who were the closest people he had left, just imagine how it must have been with others who had no regard for him. So, obviously, all of this also caused spiritual suffering for Job. In the long dialogues between Job and his friends, he tried to defend himself against their misguided accusations. But he also did not find an explanation for his suffering. In fact, the book of Job shows that he was suffering, but he didn't know the reason for his suffering. Job spoke about things he had no knowledge of and should never have spoken about. His suffering was so great that he cursed the night he was conceived by his mother and the day of his birth. He wished he had been stillborn and lamented that he was still alive. Without a doubt, these were the words of a man in spiritual crisis, but throughout it all, his faith never proved to be false. We don't know how long Job had to endure all this suffering, but we know that in the end he heard the voice of God. Interestingly, the Lord did not explain to Job the reason for all his suffering, but he comforted him and taught him about the superiority of divine wisdom over human wisdom. And then God put an end to Job's drama. He restored to him double everything he had previously owned. Job, then, is marked in history as one of the greatest examples of resilience and, above all, of faithfulness to God. Job's patience is praised in the biblical pages, and his conduct is a model for all those who face pain and suffering. Now, write in the comments if you can take any lesson from Job's suffering, and I'm going to leave a special video here for you to watch.